Hi, my name is Gamsu. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Geography Department at King's College London, and I'm very happy to have published in Urban Studies my paper, Moving Up and Moving Out, the relocation of elite and middle-class schools from central London to the suburbs. I'm going to give a brief overview of the paper in this 5-minute video. This paper really analyses the outward movement of around 50 elite and middle-class schools from central and inner London out into the suburbs and beyond, into what were then rural areas of southeast England. And this was a process which happened between the 1860s and the 1970s, with most of these relocations actually happening in the first 60 years of that period. I'm going to summarise kind of 3 key elements of the paper. Firstly, the institutional motivations and rationale behind these relocations. Secondly, the theoretical framework that I developed for looking at kind of urban educational institutions and how they work within a field of schooling which is both spatial and educational. I draw particularly on the work of Pierre Bourdieu in doing this. And finally, I'll talk about the kind of contemporary relevance of these relocations to the school system in the UK today. And in the conclusion of my paper, I also draw on kind of international parallels, particularly in Chile, looking at how processes of elite formation have been tied up with school relocation and the building of new suburbs. So the institutional motivations behind this outward movement of a subset of elite schools in the London area were really kind of tied into both urban processes. Land values in the central London at that period were really increasing. What you also saw was the outward movement of the middle classes and the elite out into the suburbs, away from certain areas of central London, which were becoming both polluted, quite industrialised in some areas. And the same factors that were affecting the clientele were also affecting the schools, which couldn't afford very often to expand, nor did they want to, in these central London locations. But outward movement also was a response to the kind of growing importance of education at that time. You had an increasing demand to attain elite and middle class positions within society. It was becoming increasingly necessary to have educational qualifications. This led to pressures both on kind of older elite schools to kind of provide this through expanded facilities, but also on led to the kind of creation of new schools, which very much saw themselves as having to compete and assert an identity as an elite school. An outward movement of the relocation really embedded a set of kind of tropes and norms to do with elite schools, which maintain their kind of symbolic value today. So this is things like having kind of neoclassical and neo-Gothic architecture, really kind of elite forms associated with other elite buildings being built at that time. Also, it provided them with space for elite sports, so rugby, cricket, rowing in particular, and provided them with the kind of space to expand physically to both take more numbers, which was both a financial and a kind of symbolic importance, because it allowed the expansion of the final 2 years of schooling, teaching of that final 2 years, which had then allowed access to elite universities, which became increasingly important. Now, the theoretical lens I use to understand this draws on the work of Pierre Bourdieu on the state nobility, in which he analyses how institutions, elite higher education institutions, position themselves within the field and rely on different kind of stocks of capital and have a kind of symbolic capital which allows them to dictate the rules of the field. And in the context of this paper, that symbolic capital was bolstered by being in these sites which were invested with these kind of cultural and symbolic values, which continue to have prestige today. And this theoretical lens that I developed also draws on the kind of the idea of urban field, which is developed in the work of Mike Savage. And I also draw on British social theorists, people like Perry Anderson in particular, to do what Wacon calls the necessary work of transposition in moving from the French to the British context. Now, these institutional relocations still have a real symbolic and cultural importance today for these schools. In a local North London newspaper, the Ham and High, which produced in spring 2015 this year, a kind of education supplement, which is essentially 30 pages of adverts for private schools. On the back, you can see a full-page glossy advert for Merchant Taylor School, which is one of the schools discussed in the paper. And the tagline is, "Wouldn't you prefer a London school in the country?" So they're very much still trading. You can see here the green fields, the historic buildings, rugby's being played here. They're very much still trading on this elite institutional identity. And this kind of brings me back to the kind of real core point and motivation for this paper, which is that we need a kind of academic understanding of urban social patterns of reproduction through the school system, which is both historical, educational, and urban, and really ties these three things together and sees how this continues to affect the contemporary system of education. And I do this within this paper, and also within my PhD as a whole, which looks more generally at the urban middle classes and the elite and how they engage with the school system in London and provincial cities in the UK. I do this really with the hope that we can kind of begin to uncover and challenge the strategies of these institutions to maintain their elite status and really challenge these kind of deeply ossified inequalities and cultures of class which have driven British society for over a century, and which also have kind of relevance and parallels in other capitalist societies across the world. Thank you for listening to this video, and I hope you enjoy the paper.